the question that brought you along is, why does instructional coaching stall, and what can actually help it stick? So you're probably thinking about either rolling out instructional coaching in your school or your network. And you've almost certainly noticed that either in previous settings, you've seen that it can work, or you've seen sometimes it can work in schools or certain years or certain terms. And sometimes, depending if you've changed roles or if you've changed organizations, sometimes we can see that instructional coaching actually is barely moving, or it's not working, it might be going backwards, or sometimes it can actually get forgotten. And I think the most common question that we get asked is why. And beyond the standard coaching answer, which is normally it depends, that's what we're wanting to address tonight. So a big thing for us is, if we do our job really well in this next 30 minutes, is with the time that we've got, our aim is that you can walk away with a clearer view of why coaching can stall, the 7 success factors that can actually support you or your school with it, and then a practical tool. We'll provide a link to a practical tool that you can use to support you with thinking about what those 7 success factors look like, and maybe what's affecting the stalling or lack of progress right now, or areas where it's really strong. And then finally, we'll give you a really clear next step about what an actual next step would look like as well. So regardless of the instructional models that you may be rolling out, depending on the state or the country or the system that you work in, our aim is that you might start to make those connections to see how instructional coaching can actually turn those frameworks or those models into real practice that happens in a classroom on a Tuesday morning with real students. No one's left now, so that's always helpful too. It'd be awkward if suddenly everyone said, I'm in the wrong webinar this evening. So that's always helpful as well. So what are the 7 success factors? I think when we think about these, we would talk about, there's 3 aspects within this. You'll see the really big circle, and I always assume we all look at things a little bit differently, especially images a bit differently. But we would say that the 7 success factors, they're not nice to haves. They're must-haves, and it's normally 1 or 2 of these are either missing or they get dropped off, and that's when instructional coaching can stall. So you'll see the big circle where I work. We call that, and we talk about that as system support. So a system being the school system that you actually work in, your school, or it could be a wider education system as well. So where I work, and then if we zoom in on those 2 smaller circles, you'll see who I am, and then the second part is what I do. So you'll see the way that you work, how you show up, how you turn up. They're the first critical parts. And then it's actually the work that we do. So the work we engage in, what we do with working with teachers, the ways we engage in it. And then that's all surrounded by the conditions or the environment or the culture that we work in. So that wider system. So we'll be talking just really briefly to each of these. And I guess the way Chris and I were thinking is with this webinar is so often for each one, we'll talk about some examples or times when we've mucked up, because both of us have implemented coaching in our own setting. So we can share some examples around it, but it's just to almost paint some non-examples or some times when we see that it doesn't work. And then what's the difference what can it actually look like when it is working and what supports it? So the first one is partnership principles. Chris, I'm going to throw to you for this one, actually.
Yeah. And first thing to say about partnership is notice it's under the who I am kind of category or grouping of these 3 kind of parts of the 7 success factors, and it's absolutely foundational. Dan, if you click on to the next slide, just to look at what they are. So this is grounded in Jim Knight's work. I first came across the partnership principles. This was my entry point into instructional coaching in about late 2011, early 2012, I think it was. And the professional learning was called Professional Development that Honours the Professionalism of Teachers. Didn't even have instructional coaching in the title. And I think they were first published in Unmistakable Impact, one of Jim's earlier books. But they've stood the test of time as a set of, I often refer to them as touchstones or guiding principles about how I am as a coach. If we look at the broader literature in coaching, they would align with what we call a coaching way of being. And so the question when we present these partnership principles to people is not, do you agree or disagree with them? Because most people sit and nod politely and go, oh, yeah. It's very rare someone would say, oh, no, I think I should be all over the top of them. And I think I should be just telling people what to do. I think it should be all command and control. And I don't want to respect their voice. I'm not interested in what they've got to say. Most people would sit and nod politely and go, yeah, that sounds sensible to me. I'd like to be treated like that. But when we actually think about what they mean in practical terms, how do I live them out in my interactions with my collaborating educators? And what's it like on the other side of that? How do they experience them? They start to come to life. So I'm not going to go through them all. They're fairly self-explanatory. But the ones that are often problematic, and this jarred with me when I first came across them, were equality, choice, and voice. Because I remember saying, actually, I can think of some members of staff that I work with that I don't really want to give them any more choice, and I've got just about enough of their voice. Thank you very much. How does that play out? You know, and one of the ones that comes up repeatedly in our work with schools is first of all, equality is a sense of your contribution to the conversation is equal to mine. Your thinking is equal to mine. It doesn't deny that there will be times when the coach is the holder of more knowledge or expertise than the coachee, but to assume that that is always the case is not a very partnership-based assumption. So we start with that assumption that our thinking, our contribution, everything is equal, even though in hierarchical terms, you're not equal. If you're the principal, if you're the head of professional learning, even if you're a coach, you might not perceive yourselves to be equal in that sense in terms of power and status. And we would say the reason that's there and important to note is that you then, as the coach or the one in the coaching position, need to mitigate for that power difference, if you like. Choice is the only other one I really want to flag there, Dan, and it's because we often hear choice as pick your own adventure. Can I say really clearly now, a whole school full of teachers all picking their own adventure? I'd go as far as saying, other than chaotic and just a bit scary thought, it's actually not a very equitable or ethical approach. And schools are organizations with shared priorities, shared goals, where you need some degree of alignment. So in a way that is, and the answer Jim gave me all those years ago was it's about freedom within form. We know that for humans, and particularly educators who have a deep sense of identity and are actually paid to think and reflect in action and be responsive in their jobs in this complex work, if you don't feel as though you have sufficient degrees of choice over your work, over what you're going to do with your classes, sufficient degrees of freedom around the things you can adapt and adjust and apply at different times, then you don't feel like a professional. And we know in the motivational literature as well that people then take their skin out of the game. And I don't think any of us want to see teaching for dummies, you know, but there's a tension there. And we need to acknowledge that tension around instructional practices, the learning sciences, the ever-increasing body of knowledge that tells us about effective practices. There still has to be a sufficient degree of freedom within that for people to feel like thinking agentic professionals. Those are the ones I think where there are most tensions, Dan, as we look at those. But as I say, if you see these as a set of grounding principles, what does it mean to partner with someone? And how do you show up in that way? Yeah.
And I think too, Chris, just to quickly build on that is, you know, this is based on original doctoral work and exploration by Jim back in 1999. That's continued to be tested and refined and has turned out to develop the impact cycle in instructional coaching. But at its heart is, if we bring this approach, people are more likely to transfer the learning and actually go use it, as opposed to if we think of those non-examples where we're not treating people equally, not giving them voice, it gets more so done to versus working alongside and with.
Yeah.
Over to you, Chris, with communication, number 2.
Communication, sorry, we did plan this, honestly, and I'm getting, you're in control of the slides, which is throwing me a little bit as well. So communication is a pretty obvious one, isn't it? And I've said probably more about partnership because it is such a foundational thing. Coaching skills, you pick any coaching manual or guide or any training provider anywhere in the world, they're going to have particular types of listening, particular types of questioning, playing back, or some, as Christian van Nieuwburg is calling it out, rather than paraphrasing and summarizing, noticing, empathizing, you name it. But those core ones of how we communicate in ways that enable the thinking of our partner rather than telling them what to do, being serial advice givers. All of this stuff is very, very well documented. And the hope for me here is that educators are, by virtue of their job, pretty damn good communicators. But actually, when it's adult to adult, we're not as intentional as we think we are. So the key things here, a key part of that, who I am, is how I communicate, how aware I am of the impact of the types of questions that I ask. For example, how often do I help that other person hear their own thinking? How do I help shine a light on blind spots and things like that? And equally, what am I listening for when I'm listening to this? Am I listening to support their thinking, or am I listening to fix? So there's some really deep-seated things there that we can sometimes gloss over and say, yeah, you just listen in particular ways and ask some smarter questions than you did before. But sometimes the intent behind those is actually quite leading, and it surfaces pretty quickly. So clearly, communication is the very practical manifestation of those principles, those guiding things that are underneath that maybe are less visible to the person on the other side of you. Yeah.
And I think too, to add on to that as well, is if you think about why it stalls or why we don't have it, the
Mm.
conversational expertise of a coach. So normally when it's not
Yeah.
working is if we don't have coaches that are continuing to engage in their skill development, or getting feedback, or even reflecting on their own coaching skills. That's a critical part too. So what can lead to feeling that it's either not genuine questions. So it can
Mm.
feel like it's a leading question. The person's already seen where they think the coachee should go to, and people can start to pick up on that. So those
Yeah.
conversational skills and the expertise that a coach brings, and the training and the ongoing development, that's a really critical part.
And we spot the tells, don't we, of a leading question. I wonder if you've thought of, Joel. Well, that's me basically saying I've thought of something and I'm hoping you can read my mind. Yeah. So why don't I just say, would you mind if I offer some suggestions here? But really, if I do that too soon, I need to understand what that's going to do to the dynamic. So there's a relational piece to this as well. It's not just about a script of clever questions that can help. But if all you're doing is question answer, I'd suggest you're interviewing somebody. You're not actually coaching them. So we can quite easily underplay that a little bit, that it's just a conversation.
So what
All
we've
right,
done now
Dan.
is we've started thinking about the who I am. So you're thinking about the way that
Mm.
you're choosing to show up, the approach you're choosing to bring, and I'm purposely using the word choosing there. So we're aware of working in partnership as opposed to trying to do something to someone. And then there's our communication skills. So if we're thinking about the way that we're showing up. And then the third aspect, if we think about this now, it says leadership. Sometimes people think around this that we're actually talking about, say, specific senior leaders within an organization. What we're actually talking about here is coaches as leaders. So if they're thinking about the ability for them to be able to lead themselves, and then also to be able to lead others. So a lot of the time, and I can relate to this the first time I started engaging in some instructional coaching, I guess there's four aspects that we'd say in this. So when you think of leading yourself, the first thing is being clear on your purpose. And the reason that we talk about this from instructional coaching is if we're clear on the purpose, we're more likely to be able to say, these are the priorities. So this is what I'm really here for. My one, it might sound really cliche, which was to help as many kids as I could in every class. That's why I stepped out of my one classroom and was able to work with different teachers. So if we're clear on our purpose, we then start to get clear on the priorities. We realize what our focus areas are, and that helps us start to really be able to also say what we can't do too. So it helps us communicate our role, but get clearer on what we are doing, what we're not doing, which helps us also talk about coaching. So we become clear about how we're leading ourselves to make our decisions, which leads to the habits. So ultimately, if we're a really great coach who's really clear on what we are focusing our time on and what our priorities are, we can then play to really great habits that we have, or we realize there's ones that we need to develop. And a critical one, normally why it stalls, is time management of coaches. So the ability to actually manage, say, your week, or it might be managing your time management in a conversation with a teacher. So in coaching, we talk about contracting. So if Joel or Greg or Yolanda comes up to me and says, "Look, can we have some time to talk through?" I might only have 10 minutes before a staff meeting. So in order to be able to lead properly, a coach as a leader, given the time that we've got, what's most on your mind? What can we talk about before our next session? So that we first of all have to be clear about our habits and the ways that we can manage time or manage our week. So there's things that we need to be aware of for that in order to start leading ourselves. Once we're clear on our priorities and what we're doing and the habits we're putting in place so that we can actually do our job really well or do the role of coaching, we can then start to think about that leading others. And that's where the two other ones come in there, where we talk about balancing ambition with humility and then drawing on Liz Wiseman's research on what great leaders do. Balancing ambition with humility is around the ability to, we're really, really ambitious for change. And we also know that we're not the expert of that classroom. So if I'm working with someone, a teacher, they are the expert of their context, their kids, they know that student at that time that maybe is going through certain things. So they have to adapt a teaching strategy that best suits their context. So I'm ambitious for change. I'll push, challenge, ask the right questions, but I'm also aware that I have to be humble enough to know that they are the expert in their space. And then the ability to be the multiplier. So that's Liz Wiseman's research around we can sometimes be accidental diminishers, or we can be someone that amplifies others' strengths. So great coaches, for them to be able to do that, we talk about them being a multiplier. And they're someone that's really ambitious for change, but they're also able to balance that with some humility to know they don't always have to be the expert. So they're two aspects that we really dig into and talk further through. And it's a critical one because a lot of the time, coaches sometimes don't think of themselves as leaders, but they're leading themselves and they're definitely leading others, and people look up to them in that way as well. And then I guess now, so if we think of, we've covered the who I am. I mean, this is such a light touch in this half an hour time, but it's really thinking how you show up, the way that you can engage with people, and then think about how you work as in yourself, but also the way that you work and support and lead others. And then we move into the what. So what is it the coaches are actually doing? It's probably what a lot of us have joined for tonight, or what we really focus on is the what. And this is the one that probably Jim Knight's research and work and the work that we've done across multiple schools, districts, different states. So it is the impact cycle, and it looks at it's elegantly simple, deceptively simple, and it's really made up of three phases. So at its core, and in the simplest way, I guess if we think about it, it's really the first phase is we identify a student-focused goal. So first of all, we're really clear. We work out the teacher's current reality. What is currently happening in your class? And from there, we can then get really clear on, so what's the change you want to see in your class? What's the change you want to see in your students? More often than not, the student-focused goal they come up with is either around learning or achievement or engagement. More often than not, when we're working with people in terms 1 and 2, it's probably around engagement, especially right now. We found with a lot of schools, entry routines, exit routines, transitions, setting norms, community building in classrooms. So, but we set a goal that's focused on what's the change that you want to see in your classroom. And from there, we can then start to say, well, given that change, what is a teaching strategy that you think will help you hit that goal? So it's less about picking a strategy, and it's more about what's the change you want to see in your kids. Because from there, that can then shift the strategy that we select. So the first part is there, we get really clear, we identify that, and then we move through to actually learning the strategy. So we're clear on the change we want to see. We've identified a strategy we think can then actually help us hit that goal. And then it's about learning, modeling, and practicing that strategy so we can then are ready and set up to go use it in our classroom. So that's a really critical part there. That's the second phase. So we walk away. That's sometimes where we'll talk about checklists, not as an evaluation tool, but as a reflective tool to say, this is what it looks like when it works well. What's it going to look like in your classroom? How might we adapt it to suit your students? And then we move into the third stage with the improve. So this is the one where it's actually completely iterative. And you can see all those little steps in there, and also the fact that the cycle goes around and around. So this is where on a weekly basis, when it works really well, on a weekly basis, we're collecting data, we're gathering some data on that student-focused goal, and we're seeing the progress happen. So an example of at the school that I was last at, a grade 6 teacher, they were focused on their entry routines. Their change they wanted was every single student ready for learning in under 2 minutes. So they were a pretty rowdy bunch. It was a lot longer at the start. And over those weeks, we practiced a certain strategy to be able to support explicit modeling of what they wanted. And then also we practiced some proximity. So through that time, we were able to monitor the change. And we're collecting the data on a weekly. She was collecting on a daily basis. And they moved towards eventually accomplishing that in 3 weeks. So in that improved cycle, we keep going back and we're just seeing and noticing the stages and the accomplishment towards that student focused goal. So that's a key. They're the three key aspects for it. And ultimately, it's really about, Chris and I were thinking, what's the easiest way to say this? And it's really about, we work out where you're currently at. What are you currently facing in your classroom? Where do you want to get to? What's the change you want to see in your students, either learning or engagement? And then given that, what's a strategy that will best help achieve that goal? And that's the impact cycle in, I think, a rapid 3 minutes.
Yeah, very rapid, Dan. And I think what the way I sometimes sum up the impact cycle is it's a process, and there are other processes you could invent. I mean, it looks a pretty typical school improvement process to most people as well. I think the key thing in this illustration here to say is, look, how do you get a clear picture of current reality? We advocate for video, but there's other sources of data there. There are a series of steps or multiple strategies or iterations and adaptations of that strategy along that line. If I were drawing this again, I'd be doing lots of little spirals around it, and there might even be some speed bumps and dead ends along the route and the reality of it. But the measure of success is not teacher X has implemented strategy Y with complete fidelity. I want to know, and so what? What difference did that make to the students or to the culture in your class or whatever? The goal has to be defined not in successfully implementing the strategy. It's in that new reality that you want to see in your classroom. And so that's a really important part of it. And if we go back to those partnership principles of choice and voice, yes, the teacher will ultimately decide what they want to do and what they want to work on because it's them in their classroom. But the coach can have a voice in this as well. This is a dialogue as well around what we currently see, we together in partnership, about what we collectively think we should be working on next and what strategies we might have available. And one of us in that partnership might have more expertise or knowledge than the other, but we don't assume that in a partnership approach. We work that out. And even in what's the most important thing to go after right now, because the teacher might see lots of things and so might the coach. So again, sometimes when we put things in static illustrations like this, they seem kind of fixed and linear, when actually that whole process there is a little bit of dialogue as well that requires the coach to show up in a particular way and deploy their knowledge and expertise in a particular way as well. Yeah. So it's, again, that always has to be around those nice diagrams that people come up with for processes. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think too, as we think of again the what, so within this cycle, and Chris was talking about this, is data. Sometimes data can feel like you say it and people get off put. So I guess the idea that we're trying to say is if we think of instructional coaching, when it works really well, people see the coach as another set of eyes and ears and hands that can actually help you really understand what's currently happening. It's someone that can also help you see and make, if anyone likes the movie Moneyball, the invisible visible. So sometimes when it works really, really well, we don't see data as something like this that we want to scream about, but really the data is actually, it's really focused on helping us achieve and get towards that change that the teacher wants to see in their class.
Definitely.
So what does that actually mean? Well, a lot of the time we talk about the 10 data rules. We won't go into all of them here tonight, but a critical one is you actually want data to actually foster some sort of hope. So a way that can look like is they're seeing that they're accomplishing. So that grade 6 teacher I worked with, they could see that they were getting a reduction in the time it took students to enter. So instead of it being used to evaluate or used to say it's not happening or what's going on, it was saying, hey, we're noticing this change is happening. It should definitely be tied to the professional learning that they're focused on. So what it is that they want. And the research and all the evidence of when instructional coaching works well, it's actually connected to their classroom. So it's a really critical thing that, and they've chosen what the data is that they would like to collect. So one of the things we used to do with some of the staff that I worked with is they came up with a rule. They always wanted the data to be easy to gather. It should be clear to them. They knew what it was. And they used to talk about a post-it note rule. So they'd love to be able to collect it as easily as possible on a post-it note. So that might be number of students engaged and on task. It might be the number of open-ended questions or closed questions that they were using, if that was the focus to really pull out and get students engaged. So either way, it was to make it frequently gathered, but really easy and connected to that goal that they want. And it's that idea, I know, oh, sorry, Chris, I was going to say, it might sound ridiculous, but it goes back to that idea. using data in a way that can foster hope, as opposed to, I haven't ever met a school or a teacher now that said we don't have enough data. So it's using it in a way that makes it really helpful for the teacher.
Yeah. And this, I was going to add there, Dan, this is really local data. And when when you make that comment about we're awash with data, it's the big stuff, and it's too late and so on. This should be timely. I often describe this really simply as, goal seeking data. So what kind of data is going to tell me what it looks like when I do what I do in my classroom right now, and what impact that's having or not having on the students? What should we be looking at? And that's in the teacher's control in collaboration with the coach. What's going to tell me the highest impact thing I could be working on right now in my classroom? Where it gets stuck or stalls is when the goal isn't student focused. If the goal is teacher practice based, you can say, yep, hit my goal because I'm doing strategy X with fidelity. And that's the measure. The measure is implementation. It's not a measure of student well-being, success, engagement, you name it. And so then as we're going through this and we've set off on this journey and we're making adaptations, the question is, how do we know it's making a difference? So therefore, the dialogue is around, well, what might tell us that? Is it looking at a student work sample? Is it an assessment rubric? Is it an exit ticket? It's that kind of granular level when the teacher and coach are in that deep partnership together. They're looking forensically for evidence that change is starting to happen. And then it's happening sustainably over time, that then it sticks. And that's so hope enabling, if that's the wrong phrase, Dan, but the reason it increases hope is because it reminds you what you're striving for. It increases goal-striving behaviours, and you're starting to see signs of progress as you go, not waiting for the summative piece of data at the end of it. Yeah, so it's really, really powerful part of the whole process.
Thanks, Chris. You can hear the excitement.
Yeah, I'm also conscious of time every time I elaborate like that. Sorry. Yeah.
No, I'm very mindful of people's time. So we're coming up to the two final parts that we're touching on, which is around, so we talk about teaching strategies, and this is about having a curated collection of strategies that are relevant for your setting. So the words that we hear a lot of people now using are talking about an instructional playbook. And I guess we're thinking of, again, the idea you signed up because instructional coaching when it stalls is often that an instructional playbook in a school has morphed, or a lethal mutation of becoming a handbook that gets given to everyone, or it can be made by one very well-intending person who has made the instructional playbook that everyone can then use. So instead, the way that we talk about an instructional playbook is, and the hardest part is, it's curated. So it's a small collection of things, not everything. So we're not discounting things, but we're saying the things that we know can really work in our setting to make a real difference. It's research and evidence informed. And that counts in your setting too, when you've applied strategies and seen how you've adapted, as long as they're still, rigorous, but it's relevant for your setting. And that's the key thing. And it's ultimately, the instructional playbook is ultimately a communication tool for the coach. It's there to help the coach be able to talk really clearly and simply about complex teaching strategies so that a teacher can better understand it and use it and be able to engage with it too. Because we know teaching is so complex, the busyness of the day. So it's this ability to help a coach and a teacher be able to talk really succinctly and simply about things that are actually quite complex as well. That's a critical part. And I think it's really important when it does stall, it's ultimately with well-intended people that maybe aren't getting all the voices in, or considering what do we know works here, and maybe questioning sometimes when they're created. And Chris, you might have seen this too, is it can be things that people really like that they've used, but we're not too sure if they're actually evidence informed or research informed too. So it's a really critical piece there too.
I think it's the actual process of creating it, and what you do with it is equally important. There is a danger that a playbook can be, there you go, we've told you. And that's no different from any other spraying stuff at teachers' PD. But now you've got a document to hit them over the head with as well. So there's a danger that it becomes that, and it's that it should be a living document that we use as leaders, as teacher to teacher, as it's not everything we do, but it is these core practices that we hang our hat on. And I remember a principal in one of the impact cycle cohorts I ran a while ago, Dan. They said, I don't like the playbook term. I said, call it what you like. It has to say something on the cover, or the file name, whatever it is, our teaching and learning stuff, whatever you like. She said, no. I'm going to call it our signature pedagogies. And in the room, there was a, ooh, that's fancy. But she was then able to say, no, it's the signature things. It's the things that we've agreed are high impact,
Yeah, really.
flexible, adaptable to different. It's not teaching for dummies. She was very rational about that. It's not about fixing people, but we know stuff. We know stuff that has a higher degree of impact than what we're doing just now. Let's name it. Let's get to that granular level, and then let's support people. And that's where it becomes a communication tool to sit between the coach and the coachee to support change in practice. An instructional playbook does not, in and of itself, deliver change. It really doesn't. Yeah.
So thinking about that now, we've moved through. So if we're thinking of the what, so we've got the cycle, the process that coaches are engaged in. We're thinking and really clearly about the data that's being used, driven by the teacher, so the thing that's connected to their goal. And then we're able to have this curated collection that keeps getting refined, that's relevant for our setting and the staff that we're working with too. So finally, and this is probably, I would say, the most critical one because it's the wraparound. So you can have all of that, but ultimately where you work. So we talk about this, as we said at the start, about system support. So if you think about this, this is the most common, these six are probably the most common reasons that instructional coaching stalls. So the fancy wording there is theoretical consistency. All that really means is, are we clear as leaders, coaches, and teachers what we mean by coaching? So what is coaching? What is not coaching? Is it performance management? We would say it's a separation from performance management. Are we clear on what partnership means? So if we say partnership, are we just saying that, but really we're just trying to tell people what to do? So it's getting aligned on what we mean by partnership. What's our approach to coaching? What is coaching? What is not coaching? And the fact that we talk about strengths based. So it's not there a deficit model of coaching to try and fix people. So that also helps with that wall or that separation between performance management and coaching, which is a really common thing that often occurs for a lot of schools and also a lot of wider education systems too. Then we can see there's a real understanding where when it works really well or when it stalls is if the senior leaders who are there trying to advocate or support aren't actually clear what coaches do. So the role clarity of what a coach does do, what they don't do. That's a really critical part around it. If they're able to do that, then they're able to privilege time, provide allowances, do targeted resourcing so that the coaches can go do what they're supposed to do, which is work with staff. And I haven't yet met any educator that said that they have enough time to do everything during the week. So the reason that we put time under those things is if we have those other conditions in place, normally that leads to time being provided. So it gets privilege, you get dedicated time once the roles are really understood and people are really clear on what coaching is and what it isn't. Then finally, there's the confidentiality. So that is the piece of, and more schools now we're seeing are actually writing confidentiality policies. So they're saying, what is it that the coaches will pass on? What won't ever be passed on? What does that look like in our setting? So that a teacher feels safe and confident enough to actually be vulnerable in those conversations without thinking, oh, I'm going to be reported on, or is this actually about my evaluation? So the confidentiality sets up trust. It's all built on trust so that people are more likely to engage in it. They see that it's a genuine thing and then further engage in the coaching, which then plays a part and actually improves the outcomes in classrooms. And then finally, with the support, that one is actually about from senior leaders or any advocates. It's normally well intended, but we would say it comes from being able to support by providing the time, all the different resources, but also setting it up so that they know exactly what coaching is, so they can actually support it. They can refer people to engage in it, not direct them to have to get engaged in it, but can provide as another professional learning support. But they also provide the supports to the coaches. So that sometimes that can actually look like when it's not stalling, is the patience after you've been engaging in some training to have some time to develop your conversational skills or start to practice the cycle first of all. Instead of normally most coaches we hear, they feel that they have to instantly engage in as many cycles as possible and be coaching everyone. So it's the right supports of seeing where they're heading. So they're the really key wraparounds that we can see, and that we normally focus on. It's a really critical part around that where you work. So they're the preconditions, and it's a really, really important part for any senior leaders, decision makers, people that are really trying to support it to work really well. So, Chris, I'm very mindful of the time. So what I thought I'd do is bring it to this one to say, so these are the 7 that we've got. So if it's stalling, it's not to say that you don't have them, but it's normally when it thrives, all 7 you have in place at varying degrees. Normally, when coaching starts to stall or it starts to drift, is if one or two of those are either they fall off our radar, or they've forgotten about, or they don't have someone being aware of these. So when we have all seven in place, coaching actually becomes a lever that can then support teaching and engagement in classrooms. But if one or two are missing, then it can start to drift, and all the work and all the time and effort that you've invested in can actually start to drift away.
Yeah, definitely. The only other thing I would add, just as a food for thought for everyone, Dan, is if this is something you're doing, or if you're drawn to instructional coaching as a mode of professional learning, which we obviously were at one point, sorry, and still are, but we were drawn to it as practitioners, at one point. A big question that we had to wrestle with, and we support lots of schools to do this, is how does this activity relate to your other things you do? I'm just going to use really plain language. The other things you do as a school to try and build capacity, enhance practice, help professionals get even better at doing what they do. You do all sorts of other things. And if you don't give real thought to how does this fit within, I'm going to borrow a phrase from a former colleague here, your professional learning architecture of your school, then it just becomes another thing to add onto the list, or it becomes an initiative. So if we're serious about this, what are the relationships and complementarities between this as a form or service to your staff and other things that you do under the name of improvement, enhancement, professional development, and so on? That's a fundamental one, and it links to the where you work and the system support pieces, particularly, Dan.
So we normally get to this point and people say that this is all great, but where do I actually go from here? And Chris, do you mind pasting in the link?
Oh,
the first one is,
yes,
I would say, so it's a free thing. So it'll take you to a digital PDF. It's a self-reflection tool that's based on the 7 success factors. So for each of them, you can zoom in, you can consider for your school, you might be thinking of your network, you might be thinking of your campus. But I would say start with that. So it's focused on going through, you can explore your school against the 7, the 7 that we've just walked through, and you'll be able to see which ones are already strong, which are drifting, and if there's any that are missing. So that one is called the 7 success factors that we call an assessment tool, self-assessment tool. The other thing that we would say is if this has been of interest, and you can see that this would be of help. So we've got some different dates where we're running our 2 days where we go through all 7 of the success factors in detail. So we dig in and go deep for each of them. So we would really recommend, if this is of interest, if you can see that this would help, book a seat at the roadshow in the city that's closest to you. You might bring along a coach or a middle leader with you, or a deputy or a principal. We've got a number of different people signing up, from principals, deputies, middle leaders, and coaches as well. So you can see there, it's going to be a busy time for us in August, but we're very excited to be coming to Auckland, Sydney, Hobart, Melbourne. Feel free, you can scan, we'll send through these slides as well. You can scan that QR code, or you can head to our website as well to look up the roadshow. But if that's of help, we're here. So I think that's the key part. I really apologise for the time that we've gone over, but we're very, very happy to be able to stay on and chat to anyone or answer any questions.
Specific questions. Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thanks for being here, and anyone who's watching the recording afterwards. Thank you for registering, and from all over.